So hello and welcome to the Expat Pod. My name is James, your host, and today I'm joined by Will. And Will, you and I met, I think, through a mutual kind of podcast guest service is the way. But yeah, you are.
To make a long story short, James, I recently published a book, which I'm very happy to talk about later. Football in Brazil, world football, because I live in Brazil. As an American, I've been here almost 2 decades, and I was told by my book coach, who I hired in the United States, she told me to go ahead and try to pitch these different podcasts. James, thank you for accepting me on your podcast as a result of this pitch that I made to you.
Always. No, I think this podcast is about sharing experiences living abroad. And as you mentioned about your book off camera, that is a chronicle of your time and your adventures and your discovery of life abroad. You chose to use the medium of football to help share that, but it's also a much deeper thing, which is wonderful. And yeah, if you do want to give a quick introduction of your time abroad, not just in Brazil, but all over the world.
Absolutely. I was born, I'm an American. I was born in the fine state of Connecticut, the Constitution state, for anybody who's interested in world history or American history, which is between Boston and New York City. I went to school in upstate New York at a small school called Hamilton College. And after 4 years, I graduated in liberal arts with a major in ceramics because my mother and sister were both professional artists. But I studied education as well. My dad was a teacher. Then I already wanted to get involved in some adventure, so I couldn't stay put. I had to leave the East, and I went west, first to Montana, where my best friend was working, but he was working in the middle of the forest with chainsaws. I didn't really see a future in that, so I kept moving all the way to Seattle, where I had a cousin. And there, I stayed there for 6 years. I came to know a little bit more about Japanese culture, and I decided to go to Japan to teach English. I stayed in Tokyo for 6 years. I was involved in corporate English training, a fantastic experience, which I'm going to tell you all about. And after that, I moved to Taiwan, where I was a corporate English trainer for 9 years. Living in the city of Taipei, a completely different experience, which I'm also happy to talk about. And finally, I went back to the United States to get my master's in teaching English as a second language in particular. And I was invited to come to Brazil, where I had been for the last 20 years. My age is top secret. I'm not going to get into that, but I married a Brazilian woman named Valeria, and I have a 12-year-old son named Miguel, who's growing up bilingual as we speak, and he just broke his cell phone today, so he's going to come home crying at any moment.
Amazing. Well, what a great introduction. We'll dig more into those stories in the main part of the podcast. So hello, welcome to section 1 of the podcast, all about getting there. So Will, obviously you've had a rich experience of living abroad in 3 quite different cultures and countries, not to mention your own country as well, which is a fourth quite different and rich culture and country. Kind of going to understanding the need or desire to want to live in Japan. What ignited that decision in you?
Before I go directly to Japan, James, I'd like to say that when I left Connecticut at the tender age of 22, just after graduating from Hamilton College, I decided that I was going to hitchhike, stick out my thumb. I had a very basic suitcase with a pair of heavy boots tied on. And I decided that I was going to go out west, as I mentioned before, to the state of Montana, because I had one dear friend named Lou Ban, who was going to work in the Youth Conservation Corps in the western part of Montana State, which is a wild place filled with mountains, filled with wildlife, and some good university towns. So I ended up in Missoula, but getting there to Japan involved my hitchhiking across the United States first. And my dad said to me, "Good luck." And my mom said to me, "Will, are you sure this is the right thing?" So I wasn't really sure if I was doing the right thing or not. But when I got to Kansas in the middle of the United States, I had one uncle who was more of an outdoorsman. So I visited him, as I did some families along the way. And he said, "Will, you're absolutely ill-equipped to hitchhike, to walk, to do anything." So the first thing he gave me was an aluminum backpack frame. And I lashed my suitcase onto that. So suddenly I was much lighter. Then he gave me a CB vocabulary guide filled with small maps of every state of the United States. So a CB is like a trucker's radio guide to the language that the truckers use across the United States. So I had some, what's your 10-4 which is what's your handle or your name, what's your 1020, what's your location, and I also had the maps. And the last thing that he gave me was a little pen light, which I had no idea. When you go on the road and you're out on the road at night, it's very good and useful to have a light. I didn't have any of those things, right? Because this is back in the early 80s. We didn't have cell phones at that time. Anyway, I ended up in western Montana, and I had exactly $200 to my name. The money was, as when you travel like everyone else, the money was slipping through my fingers very fast. And I didn't have a job, but I saw what my friend Lou was doing, working in the forest with a hard hat, with protective goggles, cutting down trees that were considered hazardous in the snow, in the rain, and that didn't really appeal to me. I could just imagine cutting off my finger or my hand, in one day. At the same time, by coincidence, there was an arts fair at the university in Missoula, Montana, which is in western Montana, the University of Montana, and I met a professional potter. She was probably not very much older than me, named Donna Roberts. And before I knew it, she invited me to come live in her home, not with her only, but with her and her husband, because I said that I'm looking for an apprenticeship. So I became an apprentice potter, and I did that for 6 months. So what I did was, in the end, I ended up taking care of their 2 kids, Toby, who at the time was 6, and Catherine, who was 4. So more than just a potter, I was more of a babysitter, but I also learned about this barter economy that they had in western Montana, where Donna would make a set of dishes, handmade dishes, and she would exchange those for a carpenter to come work on their house, which they were building at the time. But similar to my experience getting to Japan, which I'm going to talk about later, I didn't do any research. I arrived in Montana in late October. It was starting to get very cold. Their house, where they invited me to be an apprentice, was only half built. So I either slept on the floor, a cement floor next to a wood stove, or in a kind of teepee that they had set up down the back, neither of which was very comfortable. Teepees, of course, can be very comfortable, but it wasn't. And in the end, as many apprentices, I didn't make any money at all. And then I moved to Seattle, and then finally on to Japan. But tell me if you have any further questions at this moment.
No, I think that's a really interesting kind of prelude into the spirit of adventure you kind of gathered within your own country, just shows the vastness that is the US. And then when you got to Seattle and then made the journey to Japan, what was it which made you go, Japan is the destination I want to be in? What made you want to leave the US? What was the kind of inspiration for that?
Great question, James. In order to get to Seattle, I hitchhiked again from Missoula, Montana, with my aluminum backpack frame, my suitcase, etc. Because my cousin, my first cousin named Cherie, she hope she doesn't mind my saying, but she was recently divorced at a very young age, so we were almost the same age. In our early 20s, she invited me to live together with her and share the expenses. So I thought, great opportunity. I'd heard many good things about Seattle, and when I arrived, it really is the Emerald City. It's a beautiful place in the northwestern part of the United States, but it rains all the time. Probably 8 months of the year it's raining. I don't know if it's like that in the UK and Liverpool, but it's interesting because it's still mild, right? It's not so terribly cold, so you can do things outside at night. I continue to play football all year round, or soccer. I was playing in 4 different leagues. I was crazy about soccer, and I still am. My situation is a little different now in Brazil, as I'll explain to you later, but that was a fantastic part of living in Seattle. Soccer, a lot of British football players went there. They called it their Camelot. In the mid-1980s, they played for this team called the Seattle Sounders, which still exists. There was a great rivalry with the Vancouver Whitecaps, who also had many British players. The Portland Timbers, all these teams still exist. To make a long story short, again, in Seattle, I couldn't really find any truly satisfying work. I worked as a counselor for emotionally disturbed boys, which was a fascinating job, but the boys had all been mistreated. They were in a kind of group home, which was run by the state. My bosses were fantastic. They were older than me. They explained treatment plans, the different kinds of psychiatric treatment that the boys were receiving. But in the end, it was very depressing because the kids were violent. They had been abused. Of course, there were glimmers of hope, excitement. The state treated us very well, gave us a lot of tickets to the cinema, tickets to go skiing. things like that. But I lasted there. I should say I decided to leave that job after 3 years because it was too heavy for me, although I thought it was, as I said, fascinating. I learned so much. As a result, for the next 3 years of my time in Seattle, I drove a bus part-time. I tried to be a documentary photographer and journalist, but I could only find part-time work. And I participated in a land scraping crew, which we called it then, which was planting trees in the rain, in the mud, in the Seattle weather. But at the same time, by coincidence, I saw a sign. It was probably a very small sign on a lamppost in the university neighborhood in Seattle that said, "Jobs in Japan." And I thought, what is that? And then under it said, "Teach English in Japan, travel in Asia, have a great time." I don't know what the exact description was, but I paid $20 to attend a lecture. I don't remember the guy's name now because that was more than 30 years ago. But he talked about how he had gone to Japan, was very easy to get a visa for a native speaker of English to teach English in Japan. And he could make a lot of money. And he showed, of course, the most beautiful temples, the cherry blossoms, whatever else you see in Japan, which is iconic images. And I was smitten at that point. And I started, of course, I love Japanese food, which I'll talk more about later also, but everything pointed to me going there. And then I started to do some research. I bought a book about English teaching companies and foreigners who had gone to Japan, and I became more and more interested.
And then did you need to, obviously, once you decided to go, was there much work for you to do? Was it all kind of helped by this scheme which you obviously attended the lecture for, or did you have to then kind of do it yourself?
What ended up happening, which is also a little bit humorous in my opinion, and this is something that I'm going to say later, which is one of the hacks I think you need. I know you're going to get to this, James, later. I imagine you are, because I've seen some of your other podcasts. They're great. You ask people, what are their hacks? I think you need to obviously learn about the place that you're going as much as possible. You need to learn the language if you can, or as much of the language as possible. But if you're going to be hired by someone in that place, you don't have as much to worry about. But I heard from this gentleman and from the books that I read that it was better to go to Japan to teach without having a job, without accepting a job first, because you could make more money. You could meet people who could offer you different jobs. You could compare things on the ground. You could see the operations. You could meet the people that were involved. And I think that that's great advice. I think if you can visit a place, obviously that's the best possible thing. If somebody can introduce you to that place. If you can't, obviously now we have the internet, we have podcasts like you're doing, which are fantastic. But I decided that I was going to go there on my own, and I needed to save money. But my brother coincidentally told me that he had a good friend from high school. He's 2 years younger than me, Seth. His friend Brendan, also from Connecticut, had gone to Japan, married a Japanese woman, and was an English teacher. So bear in mind, this was 1988. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have services like Skype or Zoom. So I wrote a physical letter to Brendan, and I waited for a month, and I got an answer, handwritten. "Will, you've got to come to Japan. You're going to love it. I'll help you in the beginning. I'll help you get started." And that was all I needed to hear. But then he started talking about, okay, if you're going to rent a place to live, this is the amount of money you need to last for a month, 2 months. And he started to go into the budget. Okay, that made perfect sense. I started taking Japanese class, and I moved back from Seattle to Connecticut. And I remember, I'll never forget calling my dad, who, I'm imitating him, but he was kind of a serious guy, an intellectual. He was a prep school teacher in Connecticut for 40 years at the same school. And I said, "Dad, I decided to come back to Connecticut for 1 year. I'm going to live with you and my brother Seth." My parents at that time were divorced. "I'm going to live with you and Seth, and I'm going to save money for a year. What do you think?" And my dad said, "You better talk to your brother." And then he passed the phone to my brother. So, I mean, it was just a kind of funny situation. But in the end, my father supported me. My brother put up with me for that year, and I was reunited with some of my good friends in Connecticut. And then I thought I had enough money to go to Japan. But I'll get there in a minute. You probably have some more questions.
That all sounds incredible, and I guess we will touch upon your initial experience in Japan in the next section. But going from Japan then to Taiwan, what was that like in terms of what did you how did that kind of manifest itself?
Great. When I was in Japan, I lived in Tokyo for 6 years. My initial plan was only to stay in Japan for a year. I don't know why I had that in mind. I studied Japanese for a year and I worked for a year to save money, and then I was planning to only go there for a year. But in the end, I stayed for 6 years. I loved Japan. I learned more than in any place in my life because it was so different from what I was used to. Of course, I thought that I had a good basis of Japanese when I arrived, but I'll talk about that in a minute. I was completely lost. I didn't understand anything when I arrived after studying Japanese for a year. So that also goes to show that you may think you're ready for a situation, but you can never prepare enough. But once you're there, the immersion allows you to learn very fast. So I think the first 3 weeks that I was in Japan, which I'll talk about a little bit later, was a kind of slap in the face. But after that, I started to get used to it. But after 6 years, the World Cup in 1994 came up in the United States. And I thought it might be a good time to leave Japan just for a period. I didn't know if I was going to go back or not, but I knew that I could go back to the same company where I worked. I had made a great network of friends and contacts in Japan. So I knew that that door would remain open. In fact, I took 6 months off for the first time in my life. I traveled to the Philippines. I got a PADI diving license. I went to some bizarre places. Of course, Thailand is not so bizarre, but I started there. Then I went to Cambodia by myself. And I could tell those stories if you're interested. But after all that, after the 6 months of time off, I decided that I was going to go to Taiwan because I met some guys at a soccer tournament in the Philippines where I went every year while I was in Japan with my Japanese expat team, which was not really Japanese. It was more Americans, British guys. In fact, we were called the British Football Club of Tokyo. And I met a team of German guys who were based in Thailand, and they invited me to Thailand. But I also met some guys from Taiwan, not Taiwanese necessarily, but a team from Taiwan were very friendly towards me. And my team from Japan, the British Football Club, we won the championship in Manila in 1994. And therefore, I had some standing invitations to go at least visit some different places. And Taiwan was one. And I decided to go there. In fact, I was dating a Taiwanese woman, which clinched the deal. She made getting there and being there, at least during the first 6 years we were together, a cinch, right? Everything she did for me, she was wonderful. Her name is Sherry. And, of course, nothing is that easy, whether you have a person to help you or not. Taiwan was completely different from Japan. It was more, in a sense, like the Wild West, very industrial in some parts, very wild in others. Chinese, different from Japanese, was impenetrable for me. I learned Japanese in 6 years, and I was able to converse, carry on quite well. After my initial experience of arriving and being slapped in the face, I got along after 6 years. But Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, I'm telling you, James, it was a horse of a different color.
And so I guess the reason you went was because of a thriller in Manila?
Yeah, the thriller in Manila was the tournament, but it was funny. When I moved to Taiwan, then I joined an expat football team there, and they were called the Taipei Animals, and they went to the same tournament. So during the 9 years I was in Taiwan, I went to the same tournament in the Philippines. It was at a place called the Nomads Club, and it was a great expat scene. But, like many countries that you visit, not Japan necessarily or South Korea, China maybe now, which pay their teachers and employees very well. The Philippines is a very beautiful place with such friendly people, but it's extremely poor. So that's part of the expat experience. I think that it's difficult to explain, but you get to some places where you're not sure you really should be there. You're not sure if the money that you spend is helping somebody or hurting somebody. I don't know how better to say it. But we went there, and I think that during the time we were there, we were so well received by the Filipinos, that made it worthwhile.
That's incredible. And I guess you got quite lucky that you had the support from your previous partner in terms of getting to Taiwan from Japan, which is a good another good hack, I suppose, is to find a partner who's from the country you want to live in. It does make it a bit easy.
Or, which leads me to Brazil. I was invited to come to Brazil. I don't want to say that every place that I've been was because of a woman, but there was a Brazilian woman involved who I met in my master's course in the United States named Anna, and she's a wonderful person also. She was the one who invited me to originally come to Japan. So at that point, I was single again, and I had been in Taiwan for 9 years, and I was a little bit tired, although Taipei City is a fantastic place because it's got the combination of the best restaurants, the best facilities you can imagine, but it's also got the traditional Chinese markets. They are also crazy about football, although you'll never hear about Taiwan on any world football stage. But I was able to play football there or soccer, and I also rode a motor scooter, which was a completely different experience. For 9 years, that's how I got around. But riding a motor scooter in the mountains, going to some hidden lakes and seeing monkeys near temples, that was something that I can never repeat in any other place. But in fact, after 9 years in Taiwan, then I went back to the United States to get a master's degree in teaching, as I mentioned before. And I met this Brazilian woman, and she and I started a relationship, and she invited me here. But what I was going to say about the hack is we stayed together for 3 years. And then after that, we went our separate ways, and I had to decide if I was going to stay in Brazil or I had an offer to go to Shanghai. But I had, to tell you the truth, I had been to Shanghai before, and although I think it's the most fantastic futuristic city, I didn't really feel comfortable there for different reasons. And I can go into those later, but it's not green at all. There's no place to get away, really. You have to go so far to and put in so much effort to get out. But everywhere you go, you're still in China. And, of course, the Chinese people, nothing against them at all, but everywhere you go as a foreigner, you're always surrounded by people who are curious, especially if you go to the countryside, who are curious, what are you doing? So there's a group that follows you around. Of course, you're a tourist. You need to understand that that's part of the game when you travel to some places. But it wasn't the most comfortable situation. So I came to Brazil.
I think that's an incredible story and journey, I suppose, that you've been on. And and interestingly, the coincidence of partners and countries is there, but I guess not the primary reason for. But I'm sure we'll get into that a bit more in the main body of the podcast, which is section 2. So hello and welcome to section 2 of the podcast, so welcome back, should I say. And this part of the podcast is about being there. So, you kind of flirted a bit with your experiences of all these countries and, gave us a bit of a teaser into what life's like. If we start with Japan, what was your first day like, your first moment? How did that feel? What did you think when you first arrived? What was that? How can you just describe that moment?
My first day, James, in Japan was a total disaster because I mentioned to you that I decided to go to Japan in 1987 when I was in Seattle. I went back to Connecticut for a year. I studied Japanese once a week, and I remember I was paying $15 for 1 hour of Japanese class with a Japanese woman living in Hartford, Connecticut, named Haruko, and I thought that's the most money I've ever paid for 1 hour of anything. But, of course, when I went to Japan later, and I made $100 per hour as a teacher, then I saw we have to put things in perspective. But what I was going to say to you is I wrote a letter to Brendan, my brother's friend, who grew up in the same hometown as me, a small town in Connecticut, and he wrote me back after a month. But due to my extreme intelligence, rather than bringing the original letter and rather than checking the number, as you mentioned to me before, to see if it actually worked, I copied everything meticulously into another notebook. So I copied his phone number, I copied his address, and then I decided the day I was going to go was in early November. And I remember listening to another podcast that you had with another American woman named Morgan Rockwell, who went to Portugal, and she has some struggles. I don't know how to compare them to mine, but I know that she was talking about research and how important it is to research things. But my research consisted of deciding when I wanted to go without really looking into what was the business cycle, because I was going to be a business English teacher. But I didn't realize until I arrived in Japan and I started looking for a job that people don't hire necessarily, or companies don't hire in Japan in November. And in fact, they don't hire in December. They wait until the new year, which is true of many countries around the world, right? The business cycle ends. They have a break at the end of the year for Christmas, for the new year, and then things start up again not necessarily the first day of January, but the 5th, the 10th, the 15th. And to be honest, I didn't have enough money. I didn't save enough money. I saved for an entire year. I bought my plane ticket, and I think I had $1,500 when I arrived in Japan. And the very first thing that happened was Brendan told me in a follow-up letter that he was going to be out of the city of Tokyo on this day that I was arriving, November 3rd, because it's a cultural holiday, Bunka no Hi, Culture Day in Japan. So he was a runner, a long-distance runner. He was going for a run, a competition, and he was coming back at night. But he made a reservation for me in a hotel very close to his apartment. So I got to the airport in Narita. I started to see how different Japan was, but I got on the correct bus. I went an hour and a half into Tokyo, and somehow I found this hotel. The next morning, I thought, at least I can sleep in because Brendan's not coming back until 5 p.m. I just had a long trip. But I heard the knock on the door at 8:30 in the morning. It's time to check out, check out. And I thought, my word, I got to check out already. So what am I going to do from 8 o'clock until 5 in Tokyo? But the Japanese guy, he kept saying to me, Raka, Raka. And I thought, what is that? And then finally I understood he's telling me there's a locker where I can put my bags and then I can go out, walk around, and come back. So that was my first experience with Japanese pronunciation because my name is Will, very simple name, as you know, but the Japanese, they don't have the L sound in their language. So for 6 years in Japan, I was called Wiru. And I said, no, it's not Wiru, it's Will. And they said, yeah, Wiru. So this guy's telling me, Raka, Raka. I thought it was like rock and roll or rocking something, but it was locker. But just to finish this story,
sorry, go on, please.
Well, that's really, that's quite interesting. You take it for granted the sound you have in your language. It's the same thing when I was attempting to learn Swedish. There's a sound like "h" in Swedish, which is the number 7, but we don't ever use the "h" in anything. Like it sounds like you're trying to clear your throat, but it's a very common, I guess, syllable in Swedish. But yeah, that was all I was going to say. It's just quite interesting to see to have the empathy for different languages and different cultures in that sense. And you get from living abroad the appreciation of how difficult it is to learn a second language, and then you probably have a lot more patience with someone who's speaking your language because you had that experience of attempting to speak another language.
Yeah, and also that's a very good point.
Wow,
when I got my master's or attended my master's course in teaching English as a second language, I started to study second language acquisition, which is how we learn language as adults versus how we learn language as kids, right? I can see with my son here in Brazil, I've been speaking English to him since he was in his mom's belly, and he's completely fluent. But the problem I have now is trying to get him to speak English with me. I speak English with him all the time, and he answers very quickly in Portuguese. So I know he understands everything, but I'm trying to get him, I don't want to make him or force him to do something he doesn't want, but at the same time, it's a struggle. But one thing that I learned in that course and that I used often in my teaching since then, because that was back in the early 2000s, I've been involved in corporate English training for 30 years, is that if you have an experience as a learner of a second language, as an adult, you can empathize so much more with your students. And I think you can understand that side, that frustration, that inability to communicate sometimes, or the need to make yourself an actor, the need to move out of your own language. Of course, I have many examples, but I remember when I first came to Brazil, I couldn't wrap my mind around this one expression, "Aizuma," right? When you go to a bar and you order one beer, as soon as you finish or get close to the end, the waiter comes by your table and says, "Maizuma, more one." And I couldn't, because more one sounds so strange in English, right? It sounds so weird. But I couldn't say that. So in the beginning, I always said, "Si, uma mais," one more, which is the literal translation from English. Of course, the waiter can understand me. He knows I want one more. But that's not the way they say it in Portuguese or in Brazilian Portuguese. But
yeah,
back to Japan.
That's very interesting.
Again, I think I mentioned before that I studied Japanese for a year before I arrived in Japan. But that first day, I was completely lost. When 5 o'clock, the guy told me about the locker. I went to a restaurant, I remember 3 or 4 hours later to get lunch, and I had to literally drag the waiter onto the street where every Japanese restaurant has a vitrine, like a display case, and they have all the food that they serve. in plastic dishes. But I'm talking about plastic spaghetti, plastic cup of coffee, all right? And all I could say in Japanese at that time was, "Yes, please. Kore o kudasai." So I pointed to this one bowl of noodles, and 10 minutes later, the guy said, "Hi, hi, hi, yes, yes," bowing to me. That's what I got on my table. So that was my first successful experience with my Japanese, but that didn't really get me very far. The next thing I tried to do was, as the sun set, I decided it was time to try to call Brendan. And at that time, I didn't have any cell phone. I had to go to this green pay phone that they have on the streets of Japan, or they had. And I put in a mountain of coins, and I finally was able to dial the number. And I said, "Hello, may I speak to Brendan?" And I just heard this old woman, "Moshi moshi, hello." And I said, "Is Brendan there?" In English, no answer, wakaranai, I don't understand, and then click. So, as I said, I copied Brendan's number wrong in my notebook. So, what was I going to do next? Okay, in the end, one of the important things to remember when you're overseas is that you can always go back home. You can always turn around and get on the plane again. I had a return ticket. But I'm not going to give up so easily. Of course, I could have called my brother in the United States, but I thought that's going to be expensive. So I waited for 30 minutes, and I tried to call again. Same thing. "Moshi moshi." Same old woman. No Brendan in sight. So the next thing is I tried to get a taxi showing the address that I had written in the taxi. The address was correct, but the taxi driver couldn't find the place. He drove for 20, 30 minutes. The meter was clicking. $20, $25, $30, $40. My first taxi ride was $45 US. Remember, I came to Japan with only $1,500. So he finally stopped. And like most Japanese taxi drivers, he had the white gloves, and he bowed to me many times, and he got out, and I saw we were at the police station. And I thought, is the guy going to turn me in? You know, I'm some kind of a foreign criminal. No, he went in with my notebook, and he showed the police the address. And finally, he came back, and he drove for 10 more minutes. The meter kept going, and he arrived at Brendan's house. By then, it was almost 10 p.m., and Brendan was at the door in his nightgown, and I could see that it was his apartment because he had a bumper sticker, "Michael Dukakis for President," on his door in Tokyo, Japan. And he said, "Will, where were you? I thought you gave up. I thought you weren't coming." And I told him the story, but that was my very first day in Japan. But just to finish that story, James, the next day I was walking in the neighborhood, 5 minutes on foot. I came to that same hotel.
It's so much greater when you kind of you have that experience of you don't know where the hell you are. The spatial awareness is completely gone, and then it starts to click in a new city or town or whatever you go and visit, and you start to like the mental image of or picture in your head as your own internal map just grows and grows and grows. It's really quite incredible.
Yeah, and then I'll talk about, because not only the first day, but the first month. So finally, I was in touch with Brendan, and Brendan introduced 2 private students to me that he was teaching before, Mr. Tanaka and Mr. Kaneko, and they became my students, private students. They paid me cash once a week, and they stayed my students for 6 years. And this is something, the Japanese are so loyal, of course, not necessarily loyal to me. I'm a young American guy in Japan, but if you develop a relationship with people in Japan, it takes a lot to break that down. It takes a lot to do something wrong, right? But if you don't show up, if you do something dishonest, you'll lose that relationship very fast. So that's something that I learned. They stuck with me, and they helped me in innumerable ways. Mr. Kaneko had a coffee shop. I used to go there to have class. Mr. Tanaka had a fish shop, a local shop in a local neighborhood, selling fresh fish every day. He put a sign up in Japanese asking if anybody wanted an American teacher, and I got some students that way from him. But going every day in the first month that I was there, or actually in the first 2 weeks, Brendan helped me find a small gaijin house. Gaijin means foreign person, but it really means outside person in Japanese. So they have a concept in Japanese that anybody who's not Japanese is outside. But it also means that if you're from outside, you can never really get inside. You can never really be part of Japanese society. But that's a topic for a little bit later, I believe. But what I wanted to say was I tried to catch the same train outside this gaijin house I stood at the same part of the platform every morning at the same time, hoping that I would go to the same station, the same place inside the same station, which was a station called Shinjuku in Tokyo, which has more than 1 million passengers that pass through it every day. But every single day, the train went to a different track. And again, I was lost for the first 2 weeks. I'm a very visual person, but I just couldn't get it. Every day, the track was different. So I got out inside a department store. The train goes inside the department store one day. The next day, I got out on a platform, and I was trying to find my way to these interviews. Anyway, James, it was very hard. But little by little, I found my way.
And so then, obviously, being in Japan, how did you find the cultural differences once you kind of got settled there for a few years? I guess teaching English in a commercial manner or corporate manner, you must have been exposed a lot to the working culture and a lot of the just generic culture.
Absolutely.
The cross section through different businesses.
Just before I get to that, I wanted to say one more thing about my first month. In the end, December came, and I still didn't have a job. I got a few part-time students. I had a few part-time translating jobs or rewriting jobs, but I didn't have enough money to continue in Japan, and I was really so depressed that I was going to have to leave, this brave new world. And I knew that people were hungry to learn English, but where were they? I couldn't find the companies, or companies told me to come back in January or, call again in the new year. And so my money, as I said, was slipping through my fingers. And one night I arrived at a train station somewhere in Tokyo, not far from my apartment or my gaijin house. And I saw a fat wallet on the ground right in front of me. And I bent down and I picked up the wallet. I looked very quickly. I didn't see any pictures, any cards, any ID. I saw only a stack of money. And right in front of every Japanese train station, there's a small police station. And as any honest person would do, they would probably go to that police station and turn in that money. But I thought otherwise. I went into a phone booth and I looked inside the wallet again surreptitiously. I didn't see any ID. I didn't see any pictures. So I decided to put that money in my pocket, and I went home clutching my pocket. And when I arrived, probably 11 p.m. outside my apartment, I opened that wallet and I saw $1,000 inside. Just enough money for me to get to the new year. And so the next day I went out and I bought a new suit for $100. I immediately spent money buying a new suit, which probably wasn't really necessary, but I had $900 left and I made it. And then early in the new year, I got a job with a Japanese American company, which was fantastic because the two owners were Japanese American businessmen who had moved from the state of Utah. They were Mormons. Tom and Bob Kent, they moved to Japan and they started a very successful training company. And right away, Tom Kent, he was probably only 5 years older than me. At that time, I was 30. He said, "Will, the Japanese businessmen are going to love you." "Why is that, Tom?" "You're already losing your hair. You're going to get a lot of respect from these executives." But he was my mentor, and he took me under his wing. We didn't always see eye to eye, but he really told me a lot about Japanese business. So that was a coincidence. Another important contact besides Brendan. And because of him, I started teaching inside big companies. Indeed, the Japanese businessmen, they loved the American teachers like me who could empathize, but also were funny and also would show up on time. One of my other mentors, a guy named Gordon, he said to me, "Will, the most important thing about the Japanese is you have to be on time. It doesn't matter how well prepared you are. If you're not on time, you're screwed. But if you're on time, you'll do well." It is.
This punctuality is quite an important part of the culture.
Another thing, this is just more of a sign of the times, but like I said, that was the late 1980s. So the first job that Tom Kent put me up to, he said, "Will, we don't have any classes until probably another week or so. So I want you to transcribe this script to a movie called The Nuremberg Trials with Spencer Tracy from 1961. And I said, "What on earth kind of work is this?" He said, "One of the clients that we have, IBM Japan, one of the biggest clients we have, wants this transcript because one of the directors there loves this movie and he wants to be able to read a transcript in his hand while he watches the movie." So I spent hours watching this movie, writing out the dialogue by hand, and then typing it on a computer. I'm not a good typist, James, but I typed 25 pages in 2 hours, and then the computer crashed. And at that time, in the late 1980s, there was no automatic save. And everything was kind of a slap in the face in the beginning.
Well, it could be the start of your writing career, I suppose.
That's part of it. But what else can I tell you about Japan?
Wonderful. So, how about the social life in terms of how did you socialize outside of work? And did you meet many expats? And you mentioned about the football team you joined. Was there any other kind of ways in which you socialize with people, with locals?
Yeah, the very first thing was that I met a lot of like-minded people who were teachers at this company. So there were some other American teachers, Canadians, British, Australians, and we had a great community. And I remember once a month, on the last Friday of each month, we had to go to the office, and we had to physically write comments for all the students. But sometimes when you have a class 4 times a month and one student doesn't show up, maybe twice, he's on a business trip, and then the third time he doesn't really participate. I don't know how you write a comment about him every month. So we had a party. We bought Kentucky Fried Chicken, which was available in Tokyo, believe it or not, some beer, and all the teachers got together the last Friday of every month and wrote comments. And we ended up writing a lot of the same comments for different students. But in the end, of course, we cared about teaching, and I think that our students learned a lot. But another thing that I found out about very early on was a foreigner, an American guy. He had started something called the Popcorn Club. And it was a very small club next to one station in central Tokyo, one train station. Everything is connected by train in Tokyo. And I was invited there, so I went there on Friday night. On Friday night, all foreigners could eat as much popcorn as they wanted for free. And they had a pool table. They had some books, magazines. But the main point was to meet potential Japanese students. So we went there, and the Japanese students could speak English for free, but they paid some kind of entry fee. I don't know what they paid, but it wasn't the same as having a private class, but the people were very funny. And so by dint of that place, I met another foreigner from Sri Lanka, of all places. He was working for a company, a Japanese company, and because he could speak Japanese fluently and read, and he was also representing some companies in Sri Lanka, India. You meet all kinds of people when you travel. But he was working legally in Japan. He introduced me to my first Japanese football team, and he and I were the 2 foreigners on that team. And his name was Tilak. He was a terrible player. He couldn't play a lick of football, but he was a great guy. He was kind of the go-between. He helped get me to the games on time, and he helped the coach organized games. I don't know what he did, but everybody loved him. And, of course, I liked him too. But that Japanese team that I played for then played against the British Football Club of Tokyo. Not a league game, just a friendly match. And, of course, at halftime, all the British guys came up to me and said, "Will, come play with us next week." So that was the beginning of a nice relationship with this group of British guys. But the way we play soccer in the United States is not always the way they play in England. But it's definitely not the way they play in Japan. So we had a great mix of guys. There were 2 expats also from Israel. I had never met a person from Israel in my life until then. They also were very nice, very friendly guys involved in software development. Unfortunately, I've lost touch with a lot of them, but a lot have remained my friends. And to this day, I still exchange emails with Mr. Tanaka.
I suppose, and comparing that to your time in Taiwan, what was the social life like there? You mentioned, obviously, it's completely different. It was a Wild West kind of experience.
When I said Wild West, I don't want to give anyone the wrong opinion, because I think Taiwan is a wonderful place. And Taipei City is very beautiful because it's got the mountains just outside. It's not really a big city. It still has the traditional temples, as I mentioned. Great restaurants, fantastic food. And besides playing football, of course, I played football everywhere I went, and I met people that way. But besides that, and besides the company that I worked for, which was called Lado Consultants, which was run by, at that time, a guy who was my peer who came from Wales, Andy Ings, who's still involved in the English corporate training business in Taiwan. They invited me to a place called the American Club. I saw, and I don't know if you had this experience, James, or if anybody else on your podcast did, but I wasn't living the traditional expat life where back in the 1990s, especially in Asia, executives were receiving huge salaries to live overseas for 2, 3, 5 years. They had a car, they had a driver, they belonged to this club for free. But they could invite me, but I was living in some pretty ramshackle places in the beginning, including one place that had rats scurrying through the walls. I didn't stay there for very long, but that was part of the reality, right? We had this extreme between the rich executive expat life and the kind of life that I was living. But I met a lot of great guys that way. And what I remember and why I called it the Wild West was because of riding a motor scooter. Riding a motor scooter was something I wasn't really comfortable with at the beginning, but they have a specific lane on the right side for all the motorcycles. Different from Brazil, where the motor boys, who are the motor delivery guys here, they are absolutely crazy. If you, try to drive your car, change lanes, and the motor boy is coming along at breakneck speed on the highway, they kick your mirror while they're driving by. That's something that maybe it doesn't happen as much now, but when I first came to Brazil 20 years ago, it was quite common, right? But what I was going to say about the scooter is that I rode the scooter through typhoons, through horrendous heat waves. For 9 years, that was my way of getting around. And I remember once I was in a typhoon riding, and my scooter was a 125cc scooter, but it wasn't a very big machine. And suddenly I realized that the wind had picked me up and moved me over one lane to the right. But I didn't die. I didn't get hit by a car. I had only one accident in 9 years where I got 5 stitches in my knee. So knock on wood.
So I was just saying about, the rest of your experience in Taiwan in terms of the obviously different language. You mentioned about learning Mandarin being completely different. I don't know, was Pinyin? I don't know when that came into popularity, but I know it was written as a way of westernizing Mandarin, the language. Because I work for a Chinese company and we learned a bit of Pinyin, well, the concept of Pinyin to then try and learn, but it's very different. But I don't know if it was around when you were there or not, but
yeah, what I would say, and I was talking about this before, as a teacher of English as a second language, I have had in my life some very successful experiences with language. I learned French when I was a teenager, and I remember my teacher, who was a great French teacher, who I loved, an older man named Joe Stukins, who my sister Susan, she's 2 years older than me, also loved. He said to me again and again, "Will, your pronunciation is excellent." And later on, I went to France for the World Cup in 1998, and I had a very positive experience, although I had some negative experiences trying to order wine from a very busy Parisian waiter, as maybe some of us have had. But besides that, I was able to travel, I was able to communicate, so I was very happy with my French. Then in university, I learned Spanish, only for 2 years. But I was able to go to Mexico with my brother. My brother almost died in Mexico because he got seriously dehydrated while we were visiting a cemetery of all places with our host family father, and nobody in that family could speak any English except their son, who was in the United States at the time. So I had to accompany my brother, whose head was bouncing up and down in my lap in the back of a pickup truck from the cemetery back to a small Mexican town where he was able to receive an IV infusion to save his life. Maybe it wasn't so serious, but it was all because I was able to speak Spanish that we survived. But my brother tells me to this day that was also the problem, that I couldn't speak Spanish well enough to keep us out of the eating bad things or drinking bad things on the street. The third language, as I mentioned, was Japanese. I went to Japan, and in the beginning, I was lost. But after 6 years, I was able to carry on a conversation about a number of things. Of course, in Japanese, the challenge is that there are different levels of formality, which I never learned. But to be able to communicate and understand, I could do that. But Chinese, even though you mentioned the pinyin, the pinyin, that was available to read in the Roman alphabet, I just couldn't get it because of the tones, right? When you say ma, a very simple sound can be your mother, it can be a horse, or it can be a question, depending on your intonation. So I remember I went to the market one time and I thought I memorized the name of this food, and I tried to order from this guy and he just kept going, what? And I finally had to go to the next stall to order something from the next guy because he just gave me something without me really ordering it. But Anyway, I went around there are many Western restaurants in Taipei. So I would say that one experience I kind of avoided really studying Chinese. I was able to get by, and I stayed there for 9 years. But in Brazil, it's been very useful to learn the language. And that's part of my book, which I hope I can introduce later, which is called Soccer Giants of Brazil, because I'm a soccer player. But as you and I discussed, I learned a lot of immediately bad language when I first arrived in Brazil playing football with the guys. But I also learned some great slang, and I had some great experiences watching games with the so-called organized fans of some Brazilian teams. I really went to the roots, which has been great fun. And now my son is a very good ball player at 12 years old, although I don't know if he still has the burning desire that his dad had to run 90 minutes without stopping, as they do at Liverpool. He more likes to receive the ball and kind of twirl around and make some fancy moves, and then if he doesn't score, that's about it.
Sport for me, or just the hobbies in general, have been a good social conduit, but also a language conduit. So when I played volleyball in Sweden, it was for me a chance to meet a lot of Swedes, because volleyball is not a very popular sport in England. So when I joined the team in Sweden, it was predominantly Swedish. Swedes speak English very well, but if a Swede's talking to another Swede, they'll speak Swedish because it's still easier. So I got to, through osmosis, kind of understand a few words, and you kind of pick up on the same kind of family of words where it's about, specific sport or emotion, like, we were saying about caralho in Portuguese, which is like expression in certain ways, which can be quite a rude word in normal day life, but on a sports field, it's quite humorous and it's quite cheerful.
Yeah, I'd like to talk at this moment first about my Taiwanese team, which was called the Taipei Animals. So when I first went to Taiwan, I was recruited, I should say, by an arch rival expat team called the Taipei Red Lions. Although I liked the guys that I met there, somebody from the Taipei Animals also invited me to a training session. And I don't know why I clicked more with the guys on the Taipei Animals. So I decided, and in the beginning, the Taipei Red Lions were definitely trying to kick me up in the air anytime that they saw me in a game, because I didn't join together with them. But the Taipei Animals had a great crew of foreign players. There were guys, really excellent amateur players. And in this one tournament in Manila that I mentioned in the year 2000, we won the championship against 31 other teams, including us, 32, in a World Cup format, but it was 6-a-side. And after the final, which we won, a guy came up to me and said, "That's the best amateur football game I've ever seen in my life," which was a high compliment. But the guys were there in the end to have fun. And of course we had fun, but we played hard. Playing with one guy from France, French Chris, one of the best players I've ever seen. When I first arrived in Taiwan, he told me he was an English teacher, but his English was, at that point, a little bit garbled. And I thought, wow, this guy is teaching English. But he spoke English very well, and his English improved. Now he's an international trader. He can speak Chinese as well. I've stayed in touch with him. But when he got nervous on the field of play, in battle, if you will, he shouted out, "Hey guys, fuck us." And we said, "What?" But he was trying to say focus, right? But it came out a little bit different. And then another guy that I met from Ghana, I can't place his name now, but we had guys, Alejandro from Colombia. We had a guy, Mr. Paquito. He was a DJ from Spain. His father was from his mother was from Switzerland, his father from Spain. All these guys together, English was our common language. And in the end, they elected me for 2 years as the team captain and organizer. So that was also a great honor. But this guy from Ghana, I don't remember his name, it was Andrew. But he kept telling us these stories, and his English was so difficult to understand. And then he would stop and look at us after a minute and say, "You know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying?" And we said, "No, we don't. We don't really follow you." But this was the atmosphere that led to a lot of fun, joking. But in Brazil, I think I mentioned to you that as soon as I got here, I started to hear all the bad words possible. And he said, "You're going to have to get used to that." And so one of the first professional games I went to see I saw a 12-year-old kid with his dad right next to us in the stands screaming at the referee. And he said something that I can't repeat on air, but it was basically, hey, ref, take it you know where. And I said to my companion at the time, who was my translator, what is that? And she said, I think I'm going to have to explain that to you later because, but that was a 12-year-old kid, the same age as my son now. But the experiences with the language have been really funny, and part of that is in my book. You said the same thing as I said, one word that we both know, which is, I'll say it online or on air because nobody knows caralho, but I learned that. I thought I learned it correctly, so I called two of my teammates caralhos, but everybody just fell down laughing because it was never used in the plural, right? So I to this day don't really know what exactly it means, but
it's a really, really great story. And it kind of helps going forward in terms of your life in Brazil. How is that compared? Obviously, you lived in Asia for a while, for 15 years. How was that compared to Asia or North America? What was that like? Some good Latin-based languages, speak French, Spanish, English. And did that help with learning Portuguese? Does that help you at all?
I would say from the very first time that I arrived, I again thought that I could speak some Portuguese. But when I came here, the different people that I met, they said, you speak Portuguese a lot like Spanish. So Spanish and Portuguese are very similar, as are many of the Latin languages, including Italian. But obviously they're different, right? So this is something also that I remember from my second language acquisition theory class in my university, is that there's very strong interference from your own language when you try to speak a second language. Just to make you laugh and your dad, if he listens to the podcast in the future, when I first came to Brazil, it was early 2000s, but in about 2010, I went to the World Cup in South Africa, and at that time, my dad was still alive, and he always fancied British football. And so I remember he said to me when I called him on the phone, Will, when is Wayne Rooney going to win the World Cup? And I said, Dad, I don't know if I would really hold out a lot of hope. Wayne Rooney may never win the World Cup. But then my brother said to me, Will, I saw this new Brazilian player, because my brother's also crazy about soccer, and he said, this new Brazilian player's named Robinho. And I said, no, I think his name is Robinho. So in the United States, they were calling him Robinho, like Robin Hood, but the initial R in Portuguese is pronounced like H, right? So all these players like Romário, Ronaldo, Ronaldinho, they all have very specific names in Portuguese, which are completely different in English.
Well, because even in England, we called him Robinho. So it's still wrong, but it's less wrong.
Exactly. And obviously people in the know, you find out how they say different names and different, but Ronaldo from Portugal, right? Nobody would ever call him Ronaldo in Europe. They would call him Ronaldo. But one of the first games that I played here in Brazil, I'll never forget, because one guy who could speak English was assigned to take care of me. So I think there were only 12 people there. It was Saturday afternoon, what they call a society court, which is 6-a-side, one goalkeeper and 5 players on each team. So he was very nervous. He said, Will, get ready. And I said, I'm ready. And he said, you're on the head team. I kept thinking he was saying the head team. And I said, what is the head team? There are only 2 teams. And then I finally realized he was trying to give me a red pullover to put on, right? A red shirt, but he was saying head because it's the same as the pronunciation, Robinho, Romário, etc. So many times I was kind of lost in translation here. Little by little, I learned.
Well, one of the key things about living abroad is food. How Japan, Taiwan, Brazil all have quite, big food cultures. And feijoada, your picanha, your caipirinhas, and obviously Japan, sushi is huge and things. How have you found that coming from an American palate?
I mean, this is my theory, at least, and you can check with my brother Seth later, but when I write about our story going to Mexico, I think one of the differences between us, not 2 years of age that differs or makes us different, but I had the gut and the experiences, even when I was living in Seattle and then, of course, Japan. I love to eat foreign food. I love to eat all different kinds of things. Of course, sometimes I got sick. I ate something on the street or I ate something that wasn't completely clean. In all the travels that I've had, I remember one time in Thailand, I was deathly ill. I had to just lay in a hotel bed for a complete day. But I survived, and I love Thai food. Obviously, one thing you need to know is when you travel to certain countries, you can't eat things that are washed in the local water. You have to eat only vegetables that are cooked, simple things like that. But I always talk to my sister Susan about this because she and I, we love food. But my brother got very sick in Mexico, and I didn't. And we ate exactly the same things, and we drank exactly the same things. But I think the trick was that when we went to Mexico, we were invited to a local guy's house, and they had a garage band, which in the United States we call a grunge band, and we saw a huge poster of Santana on the wall, and they didn't speak any English, but they were great guys. They were playing Santana. We watched, we got into it, and then the guy showed us a bottle of homemade wine, and then we're going to drink, the five of us, three of them and my brother and I. And I remember when he showed the glasses, you could see how dirty the glasses were. And my brother said, Will, we're not really going to use those glasses to drink, are we? And I said, don't worry, nothing's going to happen. And that was the day before that my brother got sick. So obviously, I didn't, but in the end, my brother was just dehydrated, right? So it was nothing worse than that. But talking about food, all the places that I've been, Tokyo, fabulous, right? It's one of the greatest food cities in the world. And not only sushi, sashimi, but I got into a lot of different foods. Okonomiyaki, which is a kind of Japanese pizza, which they cook on a grill. As you sit drinking beer, you have a grill in front of you. You can cook by yourself. You have a spatula. They cook for you, whatever you like. Also, I had one Japanese client. He had class on Saturday afternoon. He didn't like to always study. He was a busy guy. He just wanted to learn English. The fast and easy way. But there's no fast and easy way, as you know. But once a month, at least twice a month, he said, Will, let's go to a restaurant and practice English. Great. Of course, I knew that he would pay. So one time he said, I'm going to take you to a very specific restaurant. Really? What kind? Japanese blowfish. Of course, not Japanese only. We have blowfish everywhere in the world that is poisonous, right? If it's not prepared the right way. And I believe 18 people die per year in Japan because they try to prepare it at home without a license. But we went to a restaurant, and this guy was saying to me all the time, I can't remember, it was Aoki-san. Aoki kept saying, Will, this could be our last dinner together. And I said, Aoki, stop, man. You're making me nervous, right? Because this has a little sack of poison that has to be expertly removed. And all the meat of the fish is tainted. So when you eat a little piece, you get this tingly feeling. And when we first arrived at this restaurant, we drank a cup of sake with the fish's tail in the cup of sake. And I remember immediately I got this tingly sensation. And I hate to say that after 2 glasses, I got very drunk. And I didn't die, but I had quite an unusual experience that not every foreigner has. Taiwan was completely different. I mean, if you like Chinese food, obviously, but Taiwan, Taipei at least has every kind of international restaurant you can imagine, as well as great Chinese food. And I love gyoza. I love noodles with different vegetables and the Taiwanese. But I just remember one time I went to a restaurant when I first arrived in Taiwan, and they brought me a can of beer. I ordered a beer, and the can was warm. And so I said to my friend Sherry, can you ask the guy to replace this with a cold beer? And she spoke to him in Chinese, and he came back in 2 minutes with a glass full of ice. So I guess that was how you cooled the beer in that restaurant. Sorry, one more thing about Brazil, which is this is part of my book also. I met a group of guys. One of my students teaching corporate English, he was a banker. And he saved me, which I'm happy to tell that story. Also, a guy named Fabio Nakazato, Japanese Brazilian. He saved me because I was robbed just before we went to the World Cup in 2010, and I lost my backpack with everything inside, including my wallet, my keys, all my IDs, except my passport. I had my passport safely at home, but I lost everything: my computer, my backup to the computer. But Fabio, he came, and within a week, I had a new credit card. He gave me some cash, loaned me some money, and I was able to go to South Africa with my now wife, Valeria. We went together before my son was born. So this guy, he's a friend for life. Also, another guy named Jack Blanc, who's also been a student of mine for years. I've seen his career go from many different foreign companies, Microsoft, he moved to Verizon, but all along he kept practicing English with me. Now we don't really teach and learn as much as talk, but he's helped me in so many ways, do so many things in Brazil, things that were bureaucratic, things that were difficult to understand, where my wife could not help me or didn't want to help me, but he did. And so this is another hack, right? When you learn a language, you also make friends and you strengthen your network. And I think one of the things I realized from a very early time here in Brazil is that I needed a lawyer for some things that I couldn't understand. I needed an accountant to open a company. I needed guys who could understand where to go to play in a better football game. Not better in terms of ability, but more my level, where guys are not looking to hurt you. Well, whatever. I needed to understand. Fabio Nakazato, this guy who was a great student, his sister actually introduced him. His sister was my student. He became my student. His brother became my student. His mother became my student. So I taught the entire family during the 20 years that I've been here. Not only that, he introduced me to a group of guys who played football on Tuesday nights called the All Crazy Society. They use an English name. Lawyers, bankers, one guy selling wigs. So we've had some good jokes about that. But we went there on Tuesday night from 9:30 to 11. The guys had great nicknames. Da Lua, over the moon, is the translation. Da Lua, from the moon. Because he was selling pharmaceutical products? No, because he was like a character in a soap opera who was crazy. Another guy named The Whale. Of course, he was a big guy. He was also a great football player, but it turned out he loved surfing. So he was The Whale. Baleia. Another guy, Alemão, like you, James. Blonde hair, blue eyes. So he was automatically called German in Brazil, right? He's not German. He's Brazilian. Another Japanese guy came up and he said, hey, Japa. Right? That's impossible in English. You can't, that's completely derogatory. You can't call any Japanese person Jap. Sorry to say that online, but here in Brazil, all these guys are buddies, right? It's acceptable.
I guess it's the place it comes from. With nicknames, you tend to be based on a certain characteristic of someone, and you're right, it's wrong to label that on someone's ethnicity, but usually it's, sort of a big nose, a Tokyo or something, Yeah, I think it's a fine line, but I guess it's all about the intent and how well you know someone. You wouldn't do it to a stranger, but it's your best friend, and they're happy for you to do that with them in a certain society or certain group. That as long as there's a mutual respect and they're not annoyed at it, then yeah, I understand why Brazilians or have that kind of approach to it.
That's one of the things that I have seen with Japanese people Brazilian people in general, especially this group. Of course, it was informal. The guys were all friends. They are so accommodating. Of course, my Brazilian family has been that way. My Brazilian friends, they're all so warm. Of course, there's the other side, which is, when my wife gets angry, she's very angry, right, and very emotional. There's nothing cool about it. But this group, they really welcomed me. And one guy, he talked to me, of course, in Portuguese. He was trying to learn English, this guy named German, Alemão. And he said to me, Will, I really need to learn English. And I said, why? Why is that? Of course, we were having a beer after the practice. And this was the thing. After the practice ended at 11, or the game ended at 11 p.m. on Tuesday night, once a month, or maybe twice a month, they had a barbecue. So this is back to your question of food. The Brazilian barbecue, whether you like meat or not, is fabulous. Because I would go there, and I don't know how you feel about sports, but when it's hot, you live in a tropical or subtropical country, you sweat a lot. A cold beer after is delicious. And they have this bag of French bread, and they have a vinaigrette sauce, chopped onions and tomatoes. You put that on the bread. It's so simple, but so wonderful. And then another guy named Little Fish, Peixinho, he was the guy responsible for the barbecue. So he's cutting the meat. And every time he asked me, Will, you have to admit, Brazilian barbecues are the best, aren't they? And I said, yeah, of course, Brazilian barbecues are great. By the way, Will, are you legal here in Brazil? So every time I got this joke, because as you know, there are so many Brazilians who go to the United States illegally. And there are not many Americans who come to Brazil illegally, but they still ask me every time, Will, next week, bring your passport, just so that we know you're legal here. So there's a lot of kidding, joking that is great fun. One more story is that one time a guy, he took umbrage to, I came in a little bit hard on him, trying to steal the ball. And he said, come on, Will, we're all working here. This is over a beer afterwards. We're all working here. You know, we need to wake up in the morning. We can't be injured. We can't take that risk. And I said, yeah, I'm really sorry. You know, I came in, I had a long day, a hard day. And he said, Will, why, you know, that's not the first time. Why do you sometimes come in hard? And then I said, well, in fact, in the United States, I played a lot of ice hockey as a kid. And maybe I have a little chip on my shoulder. And I need to remember sometimes to control myself. You know, sometimes you forget that this is just fun. You want it to be serious. Oh, later, after another month, we had one more barbecue before the end of the year. And the guy came up to me, Morin was his name. And he said, Will, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and a little less hockey next year. So it's just, you know, the way they say things, funny, interesting.
I realize we've been holding this session for quite a long time. So it's probably a great way of ending the second section with incredible stories and so rich and deep with all your experiences, which I'm sure will provide so much insight for many people to all these places. And great how it's all being packaged around sport is the kind of content for you, and I'm sure the people will use or have other hobbies or which have parallels, sure, in how they're experiencing their life. And that's the beauty of having hobbies, and that they just translate because it's the same activity, just in different locations, whether it's art, whether it's music, whether it's, you know, dancing and something. There's always a way of having that as your icebreaker. So yeah, we'll see you in section 3. So hello and welcome back to the podcast. We're joined by Will, and who's so generously shared a lot of his experience of all the countries he's lived in. I guess, Will, if I could ask you some advice for when you moved initially to Japan, what would you tell yourself? What bit of advice might you give yourself, apart from maybe checking the phone numbers we discussed before?
A lot of times when we plan something, or at least when I plan something, I think that it's kind of a flawless plan. I don't know why. If I just had this innate confidence, of course I've gained the confidence from different experiences I've had in my life. But like you can see a certain trend. When I set out hitchhiking, I was completely unprepared. But my uncle, by luck, helped me out. And when I went to Japan, I thought that my plan was very, very easy. You know, everything was going to happen. But one thing I didn't say, which I think would be something that people need to look into, is when I went to Japan to find a job, even though I struggled in the beginning, many people wanted me to teach, but it just wasn't the right time immediately in the beginning. But after that, I had abundant jobs, and there was 1 month in Japan where I made 1 million Japanese yen. It was the only time in my life that I was a millionaire, which was about $10,000 teaching. But I was extremely pleased. But in Japan and Taiwan and most countries in Asia, it's very easy to find a job as a teacher, even if you're not a teacher. So on the one hand, I recommend that anybody who wants to have an experience traveling, working in another country, you can do that through teaching. You don't need a master's degree like me. I did a master's degree out of curiosity about the subject, and I think it has helped my teaching a lot. But you don't have to have a master's degree. Of course, it's good to have a degree, but any degree will suffice. And I remember when I went to Japan, people were pouring over me to try to get me to work for their company. And after only a month, I went to a Japanese school to start with. I was studying Japanese 3 times a week in a class with 3 other foreigners. And after 1 month, the director of the school, who was very fluent in English, a young Japanese guy, said, Will, we want you to make a presentation in Japanese. And I said, I don't think I'm ready for that. Yeah, you are. All you need to do is speak for 1 minute in English and 1 minute in Japanese, and you're going to introduce Japanese companies that are going to sponsor an F1 race car. So the next thing I knew, I was in this huge event with 1,000 people with a race car on a stage with a Swedish driver next to me who was a professional pilot, and I was supposed to translate what he said. But I didn't translate anything. I just said a few things about me, about him, and the Japanese narrator or, I don't know, announcer went on, and I got paid $200 or something, and then free food.
Right, so your passion of sport is football, mine's one.
Okay, there you go. The point I was trying to get to was that in both Japan, Taiwan, Korea, China, you can get a visa to work, and the company will take care of your visa. And then you can also get private students on the side if you want to teach that much. And I made and saved a lot of money in Japan. And I'm lucky that I did, because I haven't saved a lot of money in Brazil. But that's another story. Because I got married, I had a kid, of course I paid a lot more bills. But Brazil was the first and only country where I've been which did not sponsor me. There was no way to get a visa here at first. You can't get hired off the boat by a Brazilian company. Number one, the tax is too high. And number two, it's a risk for the companies to take you on as an employee and then have you leave right after arranging all the paperwork. So during the first few years that I was here, like I said, I came here because of my ex-girlfriend. We were together for 3 years. After that, I had to decide if I wanted to stay on my own. I decided to stay. Then I was sponsored by a friend of my ex-girlfriend's. I was sponsored by a Nigerian who married a Brazilian who had a company. I was forced to leave the country. One time I lost my passport intentionally, and I had to pay $700 to get a new passport, only to re-enter Brazil. I mean, those are the hard tax, right? So if you're crazy like me. But another time, I overstayed my visa by some days, and when I went to leave the country, I had to pay a fine, which was about $150. So somebody told me, bring the money to the airport, and you need to go to the federal police office inside the airport. And I went there, and in my best Portuguese, I said to the guy, I overstayed my visa, I have this document, I have the money, I'm prepared to pay. And he said, he was reading the newspaper with his feet up on the desk. He said, would you like to pay now or when you come back? So, of course, I thought I was in serious trouble, but in fact, it wasn't such a big deal. And I left the country and came back. But everything that I've done here has been by dint of my own will and my own power. One more thing to say is, for example, everything here, and I think that when you live in a foreign country, this is something that's critically important. You have to, number one, have a kind of tolerance for ambiguity. So you have to understand that a lot of things you're not going to understand. And at the same time, you can't change those things. You have to go along with the system. So, for example, I remember I went to this place to submit the documentation for my visa after I got married to my Brazilian wife, right? Then I was able to stay in Brazil permanently as a resident. Not a citizen, but as a resident. So I had to go finalize my visa, and I went to this place an hour and a half by bus, and I didn't have one document. They told me, you don't have the right documents. You have to have this one document that has a QR code. I said, I don't believe it. And so I was thinking, I need to complain. I need to push my way in. No, you can't do that. But then the woman said to me when I got a little bit more under control, calm, she said, you can go across the street. They'll print this document for you and then come right back. I'll save your place. So I did. Of course, the guy charged me $20 for one page to print it, but they're working together with the federal police. And I also saw, this is something that you don't see in many countries, a guy with a typewriter mounted on the back of a bicycle. If somebody needed to type manually a letter at that moment, rather than print it out, they could do that. They could pay this old guy who had a bicycle with a typewriter mounted on the back, a manual typewriter.
I was going to ask you a question about safety in terms of, Brazil has a notorious reputation with safety in terms of whether it feels safe or not. Obviously, you spent 20 years living there, and they probably felt maybe unsafe during football matches as opposed to being in the streets. But I don't know what your first-hand experiences of that, and if people should be worried, should not be worried, should be cautious, or just advice for people who do travel to Brazil. How to be careful.
I would say two things about that, James. The level of safety here is, no matter how much people say it has improved, because of the economic disparity between the rich and the poor. We live in a kind of bubble in our neighborhood in Sao Paulo. We live in a kind of upper middle class area, not because I'm rich by any means. I work my tail off, but my son is able to play inside the condominium, which is completely safe. Of course, he broke his arm trying to show off for his friends by jumping around the pool. But, okay, we survived that. But just recently, only 2 weeks ago, my son and my wife were coming back with friends by car, and they got out right in front of our condominium. And, of course, you can get in immediately with the face recognition system that they have. But they saw, or my son in particular saw, an armed robbery right in front of the car that they arrived in. Guys on a motorcycle with helmets came up, held up a guy right on the street in front of our condominium. And I've also heard stories from my various clients that they've been held up. They've been taken to places outside the city. One guy thought he was going to be killed because the person that took him in a car by force was on drugs, but he survived. So I would say that you have to talk to people. You have to be prepared. If people want to come to Rio de Janeiro for Carnival, it's the biggest festival in all of Latin America and all of South America every year. But it's also unsafe. But you don't go walking outside necessarily with all your credit cards and your passport. You leave those in the hotel. You go outside with cash. If you lose that cash, okay. But then my wife said to me one time when I was walking in our neighborhood every night during the pandemic, she said, you shouldn't go out anymore. I said, but I'm not getting close to anybody. No, you shouldn't go out because there are a lot of robbers around during the pandemic. And I said, but I don't carry anything. I don't carry a watch or I don't have a cell phone. She said, actually, that's worse because sometimes when the robbers see you and you don't have a watch that they can take or a cell phone, then they'll shoot you because they're angry that you don't have anything. So then I was really confused. Sorry, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but we never know. It's an unpredictable situation. We've thought a little bit more about moving back to the States, and that's something that is under discussion.
Because that was my next question in terms of your future, the next steps for you. Is there another country? Obviously, the States you mentioned before you're going to go back to, and I guess your son's an age being 12, where it's a tough age for schooling in terms of what way should you move if you were going to move that?
Yeah, now that I'll make a quick pitch for my book. Now that I've written my book, which is Soccer Giants of Brazil, it's also called One American's Take on Samba Soccer Culture. It's a book not only about football and my adventures with football, some of which I mentioned here, the people that I've met, the music, the food. I include a lot about the culture, which I think is very important. And as I mentioned before, I'm happy to say again that Brazil is one of the most welcoming places that you can ever visit or that you can ever work. The people are very open, very receptive, and as students, for an English teacher, they're very responsive. So that's very useful and helpful in my job. But at the same time, I have a college friend named Mark Sullivan. He's also a very famous writer, much more famous than me. He's written quite a few successful books about World War II, including Beneath a Scarlet Sky, which I love. He came to Brazil during 2014 for the World Cup, and he and his wife were on the beach in Rio de Janeiro when they did this kind of sweep that they do, which is a criminal sweep. The gangs come along the beach, and they take everything that everybody has. So if you go there with a watch, if you go there with a cell phone or money, you lose all those things. It's nothing violent, but you give away what you have. But he and his wife, along with hundreds of other people, they entered the water, and the bad guys didn't go into the water. So they were kind of waiting to safety or waiting until the tempest blew past. But because of my Brazilian network, I have 2 students who are now in the United States, in the city of Orlando, Florida, and they're developing a kind of business empire, and they're opening some English schools. So I have an offer to go back and work for their English school, which is called Ideal English Schools in either Tampa, Orlando, maybe Jacksonville. So this is something that I'm really looking at seriously after spending 20 years here.
That's incredible. And yeah, well, good luck to you in whatever future you choose. And yeah, I guess anything more you want to add about your life abroad? I know it's been quite extensive, and you've done you've managed to pack in 35 years of traveling into 2-hour recording, which is incredible.
Thanks for your patience, but I think also you need a sense of humor, and it's best if it's self-deprecating, if you can laugh at yourself. But I'll never forget one lesson that I learned. I'll just wrap up with one lesson that I learned in Japan from my boss, my Japanese-American boss, Tom Kent. I told you, we developed these very successful workshops where we went to these companies like IBM Japan, and we trained the executives that they had to make American-style presentations. Okay, in fact, they're not learning how to make any different style presentation. They were really learning the English that is used in presentations so that they could present in English to American executives from IBM. But my boss told me there are some things that the Japanese, they really can't do very well. Number one, if you ask them to make a short, concise presentation, it's very difficult for them. They always start by talking about the background, the history, and they go on, and they don't really get to the point. So our job was also to try to teach them. Americans want you to cut to the chase, get to the point, be straightforward. So we were trying to teach a little bit about the culture. And then we had one exercise, which was very funny. We had them learn the so-called physical skills of presenting, better eye contact, more hand gestures. The Japanese were not used to that kind of thing, but some of them were very good because they could step out of their shoes, right? They could try something different. But I remember that we had one eye contact exercise. It was kind of ridiculous, but we had them practice. So I had one senior guy together with one junior guy, and I was getting them to try to introduce themselves to each other, making strong American-style eye contact, right? But the junior guy, he couldn't look the senior guy in the eye. He kept looking at the floor, kept looking down. And I kept saying, you got to make better eye contact, stronger. But then I realized that's all my point of view, my culture, my way. And so I told that to my boss, Tom, and he said, yeah, Will, you probably won't change Japanese culture or 1,000 years of it in one class. So relax.
Yeah. No, that's a really good anecdote. I think you definitely end on in terms of you have your own views on certain things. As you mentioned before, you can try and teach a way to people to express themselves their way. That's 10% of that sticks, then we become a more diverse culture. Each millennia for things to change and full cultures to adhere to. But you have these fusions and you have all these incredible, unfortunate, violence, refugees, mass immigration, where you see these huge cultural changes, look at Chinatowns over the world. In Brazil, there were lots of Germans who fled from the war.
That's right. Germans, Italians, Japanese.
And thank you for sharing your book. And I think a lot of we talked about was about your incredible experiences of sport whilst being an expat, and hopefully people do purchase that book. And
one thing that you said before when we began to make contact with each other was that you automatically thought that my book might be a good gift for your dad. So I was tickled. I was pleased. Your dad's birthday is coming up in June. Happy birthday to him. And who knows, he may receive a copy of my book. And at some point, if we meet, I'll sign it for him, for you.
Wonderful, yeah. Well, as always, if you have enjoyed the podcast and have found it useful, please do let us know in the comments. Please do get in touch. Please do share with your friends and family and anyone else you might know who's lived or worked abroad, whether they're looking to go or in the process or have done it for years. Hopefully people can find some great parallels with the stories we tell here, and in particular Will's incredible journey throughout the East and South America as well. And as always, we'll see you next time.